I would say within like this menopausal idea, I think it's less about moralizing like our own behaviors on earth and more about reframing like who is seen, what do we listen to? If we are better at recognizing these signals, right? How do we open up those kind of conversations, or how do we sort of modify behavior, both personally and collectively?
Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to the
broadcast from later. Baldus is here, Jeremy is producing, Mimi Zeiger is here, critic, editor, curator, instigator. Did I pronounce your last name correctly? I should check.
You did.
Great. Well, welcome, Mimi.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to see you again. So what's going on? What's new?
Well, here I'm back in LA, where it's once again sunny, 80 degrees in the middle of October. We are at that moment in the season where we can either claim climate change or pretend that this is, part of the normal way we ride through things. No one's complaining, which is actually probably part of the problem. So, yeah. That's kind of what's new is what's not new, perhaps.
The weather. I like that was right like now. An AM radio response. We're cruising through Los Angeles at 80 degrees.
I'm David Lynch, who does it every morning here from Los Angeles.
Oh, does he?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool. But are you writing anything? Are you curating? What's happening in that part of your life right now?
I'm the guest editor for the New York Review of Architecture Los Angeles issue. And so I have been up to my neck in thinking about what is going on in the built environment here in Los Angeles. And we're looking at an issue to launch in January. So I've been thinking about and time a lot in relationship to LA, because as we've been getting these stories in, I've noticed that so much of what people think about LA is looking backwards. So maybe I'm excited to be here with you guys to look forward. But I have to say, I'm much more a believer in sort of circular epistemologies of time rather than sort of straightforward direct trajectories or sort of nostalgia. But yeah, this issue has got me scratching my head a little bit, because I am trying to keep us from, just sort of romanticizing the eras of mid-century modern in Los Angeles, and sort of think about what's the future of this city, and the present, quite frankly, and how we're getting there.
Yeah, it's hard not to do that, just even as someone who visits LA. That nostalgia that it was just so ingrained in us through watching films and things.
Even contemporary films are about some sort of reference to the past, in the more recent pasts, even, like that we are kind of caught in a bit of a cliche of self-representation. This is why it's interesting for sort of the futurists, is that there was that mid-century moment where LA was the representation of the future, right? And then again, in the 80s, it was intent on being like the city. This is the city of Blade Runner. This is going to be the predictor, here on the Pacific edge of where the US is going in terms of its urbanism, in terms of its questions of class, in terms of, sort of technology. And then it kind of just didn't. It kind of just stalled out. And now it's a predictor in other ways, or maybe in sort of much, not to say that Blade Runner is light, but there are sort of darker elements that if we use those as predictors, we have a homeless population of 70-some thousand people, and the cost of living is so extraordinary that migrants are not actually, we don't have a migrant crisis in Los Angeles, because migrants are told not to come to LA because you won't be able to afford it. So it's a kind of interesting moment in time to be here, a difficult moment for a lot of people, but it is, it's a kind of tipping in terms of what this city is, like where in time it is at any given moment.
Yeah. The image and the idea that you can apparently rent like an RV or trailer that's parked on the street in LA right now feels like a signal in the built environment of sorts of where things are at. That's dystopian in ways. Yeah.
Yeah. But there's moments of joy, I suppose, in it. I was recently down on the LA River and walking. Okay, so I talk about like signals of a dystopia, right? The concretized channel is like the vision of a Terminator, right? Like this is what we all like remember. But the artist Lauren Bond and her organization Metabolic Studio is in the midst of a project where they have created a hole in the LA River. They broke into the concretized channel, drilled down, and created a pump that is pumping water from under the concrete to a park, and it has a filtration system on it. And that water is being used to irrigate other landscapes. And she sees it as a speculative project, right? That if we can make a little acupuncture along this, 51 miles, if she can do it, anyone can do it. It's not 100% true, but it's about sort of like laying the groundwork for a permitting system. But my favorite part of the visit is that when they took out the concrete, they found a riverbed under the concrete. And when they excavated, they did an analysis of the dirt that they found, and it still had seeds and bacteria and mycelium in it. And they spread that material out on their studio landscape that they have, and they watered it. And within 6 months, the whole sort of river landscape had bloomed with the things that were 80 years old at this point. Those seeds had sort of enough nutrients in that they were able to reproduce themselves. And so I like, again, that circular time, right? Like we had to travel back in time to gather these seeds that had stayed in like a kind of vault and then bring them into the present. And now they're expressing themselves as this like incredible, well, just what you would think you would find along a riverbed, right? The willows and little bits of oak and some marigold that had somehow gotten in there, which isn't indigenous, but maybe washed down from the cemeteries or something.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that with us. I had no idea about it. That phrase, acupunctural, was Aldous and I were talking about just yesterday, actually.
Really? In what context?
In the context of architecture, how it's being used in architecture. And kind of where else it could be applied, I guess, looking at the, how where else the metaphor would work. But yeah, acupunctural strategies. Yeah, it's funny how every time natures in those ways, like you can't help but see the sort of some kind of like symbolic meaning and feel a bit moved by it. And I don't know, I was just recently hearing from someone who had visited Laos, and visited like the most bombed territory in the world, where there are these craters that are all just now like filled with plants and flowers and stuff like that. And also where there are people who live there who had to escape to caves when the bombing was happening, but who've like used the shells of these bombs as like planters and things like that as well. I mean, horrifying situation, but then there's these images that are like just quite moving and beautiful.
Yeah, it goes to that idea of resiliency.
Yeah,
I would say, but like we often talk about it, at least in architecture, as like a building having to withstand. But here it's about like a resilient landscape, right? It reasserts its own, sense of identity, right? Where it maybe kind of takes back what was already theirs, right? And it took this act of violence, and not that I'm condoning the violence by any stretch of the imagination, but that act of violence sort of liberates the landscape from whatever had been happening there before, whether it was like agriculture or some kind of development on the site.
Going back to the New York Review of Architecture Los Angeles edition that's forthcoming, are you circling on a theme, or does it feel like there is something coalescing in terms of like what's new or what's a new way of thinking about Los Angeles architecture?
Well, I think Los Angeles becomes its own theme, right? LA plays itself always. That's the self-referential component of it. I wouldn't call it a predictor of LA architecture, but like we are looking at things like the upcoming Olympics and how that is both a political and urbanistic condition, right? That we are, in a way, this as a city, kind of unprepared for, and that the moves that are going to happen are not the kinds of big gestures of, like, say, like China, of building all these stadiums. It's about repurposing stadiums that are already there. And then it becomes about mobility, right? How do people get from place to place? And the bulk of the investment perhaps is around sort of transit and mobility. And so I think that that'll be an interesting sort of way to think about the city, right? Or through the metro, which is not something that we often associate with Los Angeles.
Could change things a lot.
Yeah. And simultaneously looking at like the Lucas Museum, which is by Mad Architects, which is that Lucas. It was a design that, really is, sci-fi in like kind of corniest of ways, but also quite a feat of engineering. And it is due to open in, I think, 2025. And it is going to have both art that is around narratives. It's Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. So really some great curation around sort of how do we tell stories, but also some residue from sort of the Lucas Empire, if you will. So it's kind of this strange conflation of two worlds as told through this lens of narrative.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. The building looks like something from a Lucas future. Right?
Yeah. Like a sperm.
What do you think it's going to birth with that sperm?
What's it going to fertilize?
This is the psychosexual fantasy of George Lucas at urban scale. He's bringing into being, I don't know, something with narrative. He's like Ray Kroc, but for narrative media. He just set up all these franchises.
We slurp them down like milkshakes because like some of them are actually kind of great.
Yeah.
I have a update on a signal about this. I don't know if you saw this, but you brought in the signal about the Vesuvius project not too long ago. Flint and Robinson, who was, I guess, one of my guests that day with Kofi, sent me this update that came in. So the Vesuvius project is this prize that was going out for teams who could use these new sensing technologies to unravel a scroll, ancient scroll, and try to understand what it says that had been carbonized and couldn't be unwrapped without being totally destroyed. And using particle accelerators and machine learning technology that I don't understand, they seem to be able to get through some of it, and it's an ongoing thing. But the first prizes have been awarded for people who got a few of the letters, and I believe it says something about like purple cloth or something like that, which is great. I think it's a starting point.
Purple. Oh,
purple.
Who knew? Fascinating.
I have another one update. We didn't use it as a signal, but when we wrote the LinkedIn post for, I think, the Global Flows report, there was that sort of throwaway line about McDonald's Red Armies, like sort of these kind of corporate military forces, because we were talking about what's going on in Ukraine. Did you see that the different Middle Eastern McDonald's were supporting different sides of the Hamas-Israel conflict? Yeah. And we posted like 6 months before, what's next? Like McDonald's armies going to war. And here everyone's now on Twitter making jokes about McDonald's armies.
Oh, Ray Kroc again.
It keeps coming back, right?
Yeah.
So what's new up in Toronto? There's big things on the table we're kind of avoiding, but...
Play about sidewalk that you went to.
Oh, yeah. In architecture, I saw a really good play about the Sidewalk Labs debacle here, where they were going to be building their smart city, and it was very detailed. I think 3 hours in length. I mean, I really enjoyed watching it. It really told kind of the whole story in depth. They kept repeating that it was a work of fiction, but it was very clearly like as close to the truth as they possibly could. So from what I could tell, but yeah, that was a great sort of entertaining piece of, urban planning theater in Toronto that, I could see that ending up in other cities. I hope so. It was very well done. Good acting and everything.
Did they make characters out of urban pieces, or like where is it people telling the stories?
Yeah, it was the story of the bureaucracy basically leading up to and it eventually this thing not happening. And I guess the moral in the end was, as much as this whole project was ridiculous, there were real needs for things like housing, and there was real potential to do something there. And the sort of, in the end, ridiculousness, bureaucracy, the motivations of Sidewalk Labs and Google, all of these things kind of got in the way of getting some good work done, and the challenges of just doing this work credibly, I guess, and collaborating well.
There's been all kinds of stalemates and sort of backpedaling in land rights claims. And so there's been a lot of land related and real estate sort of related stuff that's been going on here. So, I mean, I'm not sure if it's maybe similar to LA, but certainly affordability has been a challenge for a lot of people. And I saw somebody post about it and sort of saying it's like a stalemate, that it's now considered a buyer's market here, but nobody can afford to buy. So in this weird sort of, what do we do about it?
Yeah, I think around here it's similar. Like there's the affordability has gotten to the point that people, cannot make good on any kind of quote unquote American dream, California dream. And then, areas of concern, are where most of the speculation is going on. I think the corridor of the LA River, once they started sort of looking at an LA River master plan for it, the price of land on either side of the river started to go up, and then contentions over gentrification popped up as well. And so currently, Gary Partners is leading a master plan effort, and it's resulting supposedly in a series of parks in a neighborhood called Southgate, which is one of the kind of poor neighborhoods, and that this is meant to drive investment sort of in that neighborhood. But sort of the idea of displacement is really kind of looming over all of it, right? So how do we build more housing in a city so desperate for it without that housing becoming a trigger for people actually having to leave, right? It's the same old gentrification story. And at the moment, I think people are pretty enamored of these ideas of parks, but I've seen sort of this also come up in chats in, say, Chicago, that the parks become the feed for what might happen around it, right? And so you build a park to serve a community, and then the community leaves. So there's a big project going on in Crenshaw in South LA that is a series of parks along the Expo line or the K line. The park is called Sokofa Park. It's called Destination Crenshaw. It has incredible buy-in from a mostly Black community there, and it's a celebration of Black arts. And basically, I wonder, will that community still remain by the time that they finish building this park, right? That it ends up wanting to be a celebration of a community that perhaps is gone and becomes much more of a kind of elegiac space.
You might have heard of this book, Mimi, Iceberg Zombies and the Ultra Thin, Matthew Sewell.
Yes.
Yeah, who has this take on like how is different from what you're talking about, but related to like the same way that financial interests end up shaping literally like the built form itself, like the urban environment itself. And so the shape of different buildings in an era when real estate has become such a commodity valued for its liquidity, you start seeing architecture take on like effectively more liquid standardized assets. And so when you look at these giant towers, some of them are designed to facilitate overseas owners. So because people own like a portfolio, own multiple properties, that wasn't common 50 years ago, except for the very rich. Now it's like not that uncommon for people to own 1, 2, 3, whatever types of properties. There are TikTok influencers who do all the whatever, the rent slumming and stuff like that. But for like an average person just using it as a speculative investment, it's interesting to think about how the shape of the building takes on almost like financial characteristics, And so like when you're not there, when it's low occupancy, you need like better security. You need to standardize the rooms so that like when you don't visit, maybe you don't even see it. You just buy it from a catalog or something like that, right? And so you just want to understand that the value is going to be worth something in 20 years. And so it has to without you visiting it, has to give off that era of being valuable. And so it leads to things, maybe this is a segue back to what you were talking about. It leads to things like trying to add parks and stuff at the bottom, because it's like, oh, it'll be worth a lot. Look how nice it looks in these renderings and stuff like that to people who've never visited. But that's like that's a net new development. That's not the redevelopment of an existing community for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best example of that is Vignoli's Pencil Building in New York, right?
Uh-huh.
On 59th Street, I think it is, where every floor is like a multi-million-dollar apartment. And like, I'm going to draw a number out of there, but like 80% of it is mostly vacant any given time. And that the building itself shows the economic sort of striation of what makes it happen. So the apartments on the top of the building, at the kind of top of the pencil, are the luxury apartments. And then the middle ones, the ones that haven't yet cleared the view line, are the ones for the support staff. So people not only buy multiple units everywhere, like, in different cities, they also buy like a multiple units in one building so that they have a space for their staff and a space for themselves. And that they be, if you can get the view, then, it's worth more. The parks are related. There's a zoning trade-off that if you give back what they call a POP, which is a privately owned public space, it is an exchange for going taller. So that there's a kind of doubling for what that park is doing, right? It's providing a kind of marketing draw and then simultaneously allowing something to go taller.
Interesting. And those pops, at least here in Toronto, I feel like there's always a sort of ambiguity of like how public and how welcome everyone feels. And they don't always succeed at feeling like public spaces, but really just serving maybe the people at the top of the tower.
I mean, they're illustrating some kind of zoning policy is really what they're doing.
Yeah. Let's get started. Valdez, do you want to share your weakest signal?
Okay. It's pretty stupid. So
Nice.
This will be like that meme where you turn off of the highway. That's what I'm doing right now, into just not very intelligent territory. This is on TikTok. There is like a voice filter feature that allows you to generate a certain human's voice. And so just as in the same way that you have the image filter, where in real time you get whatever, your face gets morphed and stuff like that, or something else is put on it. Now you can do it with your voice, and you can get your voice to speak in different ways. And then classic, people are just going to use it in ways that try to break what it is. People have just been like applying it to like cats and fans and like the sounds of traffic, and just getting it to start speaking in the sort of filter voice. Yeah. And I think they do, like, they will speak like words at certain times too. It's not just like a different sound of whatever white, brown noise or whatever. It's like, it's starting to see a pattern or something like that of a word. And that's kind of it. That's, I'll say outright, I don't really think it's a signal, but it's
let's see what we can do with it.
It's a thing, yeah, that people are doing.
So white noise and animal sounds and whatever sounds that might come up, filtered through this TikTok filter, starts to produce sometimes words. It doesn't just morph the sound. Like
a cat that sounds like Tom Cruise, or something like that.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So it could do both. It might meow in the sound of Tom Cruise, but it also might produce a word.
I think so. A little embarrassing. I heard about this a few weeks ago, and then I forgot. I didn't have time to check it before the call, but I'm pretty sure it was saying words. It wasn't just adding the filter to the sounds. It was picking up.
You didn't find this firsthand on TikTok yourself, eh?
I always have to do that because they try to get you to install that app. And I hate apps. I have like 4 apps on my phone. So I'm pretty limited. I can only see the top 4 videos at any given moment.
Secondhand TikTok signal.
Well, that's a signal, because I used to make fun of it, because Instagram would always repost Twitter stuff. And you were like, oh, well, the best stuff's happening on Twitter. Now, often on Twitter, it's like reposts of TikTok. So
often in the New York Times, it's reposts of TikTok, Often. I mean, it's like, it's like how many New York, it would be an interesting thing to count in the past, like 5 years or something, how many New York Times articles have been like summaries of things that have happened on TikTok or trends that are whatever's trending on TikTok.
I mean, I assume that everything that goes into the TikTok hive mind is basically data to be repurposed for something later. So I wonder, like, if this is a training app for something else. So I wear hearing aids, which have algorithms built into it to like filter different kinds of sound. And when I think about like, okay, if you're going to record like a sound, like traffic sound, it's like messing with the data set in a way. And so what I'm wondering, like, what will that do? Like later on when they start to pull the data out, like they're just going to have a lot of junk data in it, which is maybe okay. But like, okay, like, could there be a point where like I do an update on my hearing aid app and like I start hearing words in the traffic, right? Like I'll start getting, messages, from my dog or something based on his barking. So I think, there's something peculiar in it, maybe not in it, like it's dumb in itself as used on TikTok, but like what happens like, 2 years out when they take that, that raw data and sort of try to interpret it.
Yeah. Or the reversal or something. Someone's talking and all of a sudden you start hearing like meows or just like white fan noise or something like that when it should be attempting to make it sound clearer or change the sound of the voice. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
Do you ever think about like what the rise of like AirPods and stuff like that is? Because it's like, well, it's interesting that they don't so far, like as far as I know, I don't filter the audio that you're hearing in the way that a hearing aid does, but it doesn't seem like that far a step to think that that might be like another thing they add to it in the future.
On the other hand, I could probably, if there was, if they added a couple sliders to TikTok, I could filter voices into a pitch range that would be more comfortable or something like that. Like I know this is sort of a smaller application, but like I do sort of see it as like, okay, but maybe there is something both sort of in that sort of like a lot of junk data side, but also like what happens when we take control of what we're hearing, especially since we're often hearing it through devices these days, not just hearing aids, but like through earphones, like we can continually sort of augment and customize. I mean, not that we can't kind of do that now, but like, where are those sort of tunings coming from?
I'd want to slow everything down 30% and just live in a kind of blissed out world. I don't know how it would work to keep up with all the ongoing sounds, but stretching it and pitch shifting it down would be kind of nice.
There's like the podcast function.
Oh, to speed it up. Yeah.
You can slow it down too, which I also do.
Oh, okay.
Some of those podcasts are already sped up. And so it's like, I mean, you can go pretty slow. Usually it's like, I'm going 1 degree slower, but sometimes that's nice. The question I have is like about how much further you can take the misuse. I guess this is what people are doing, but you can kind of start to like find the linguistic poetry from misinterpreting sounds out there. Curious to know like why that happens, what it is that makes, a fan or something like that sound like a particular word.
I have a white noise app that I go to sleep with every night, and I have a bird song alarm in the morning, and I will often hear bird song in my white noise, even though it's not playing from my phone. Because white noise or any kind of like noise like that has that quality. And generally, if you filter out certain frequencies, it starts to sound like certain things. And they generally will use that as a synthesis technique. But I'm curious. I mean, obviously you start to think with TikTok and these things, like they're getting the input signals. I guess they're getting them anyway when you're recording it. But like you're hearing back this new sound, but like how much is it actually capturing? If it's able to sort of interpret or like translate one sound into another, like what else is it getting? I'm getting like thinking like blow out the conversation kind of vibes. Like what else are they getting in the background? What else can they be picking out of it? And also I was just curious whether are the voices realistic? Like do they sound kind of like natural and yeah, or do they still sort of sound like the AI narration stuff where it's a bit forced?
Well, when they do it with like fans and stuff like that, then it sounds really weird. It starts behaving very strangely. Have any of you heard of like sine wave speech and this thing that happens? Do you want me to? It's like a 30-second thing.
The man read the newspaper at lunchtime.
You got it?
Yeah. Like the early like text to speech.
Yeah. Well, I think it's how they synthesized voices at the beginning. But this was like used in cognitive psychology studies in the 60s and has continued to today, where they're trying to think through the problem of the brain as a kind of predictive machine, is what they sometimes call it, which is to say that a lot of what you perceive is actually what you expect to be there because of your memories and past experiences and the context and all these different factors that go into perception. So it's not like your brain is just taking in sensory inputs, processing it and then producing a kind of interpretation of it. It's actually actively projecting ahead of time what's about to happen in order to like make sense of it.
Right.
Which is part of why, like, when you hear a foreign language that you're not used to, it's just, you hear it for what it is, which is like, there are no breaks in the words. It's just a continuous stream of sounds, right? But when you're enculturated and entrained in listening, you can break it up and it's actually components and there's rhythms and patterns and all that stuff that you can't hear otherwise.
It's like the phenomenon when you're in like a noisy room or something with lots of people chattering and someone on the other end says your name, and it's like you hear that for some reason that stands out.
Yeah.
So it's things like that. So like that gets really interesting to think about the similar types of like kind of innate biases that machine listening might have, machine hearing, like what based on its data set, like is it going to choose to parse, how will it parse things and what will it choose to sort of record or to translate or how it interprets? Because they're clearly using those things all the time. I mean, even in the automated stuff in the Zoom call, there's built-in kind of assumptions about separating my voice from any room noise or anything else that might not be as much of a priority. I don't know enough about how it works.
I wonder if people are doing like style transfer between like different languages. Like there was a thing online that was circulating last week. It was, I think he might have been from Pakistan, a guy who was speaking in a totally nonsense language, but using the lilt and cadence of American English, at least what it sounded like to him. And it was so good. It sounded so hilarious. But it was just there was no real words in it whatsoever. No real American words in it. It was just the rhythm.
It reminds me of like pop songs, that are recorded by like bands in like the 50s and 60s who wanted to be American, but we had that same sort of like pick up the American lilt or sort of use American words, but maybe not have sort of knowledge of like what the words really were. French pop or something is like somewhere a kind of cross between a kind of an Americanized set of scatting or something, and then, sort of French lyrics.
I know. I find that often it produces like really cool effects. And then, I don't know, like where I've paid more attention to this stuff is just like the development of like rap in different languages. And it's really interesting how it felt like behind for many, many years in most. And there was times where like certain languages worked better than others, but eventually it seems like almost every language has like found a way to work with it. Like French rap, for I would say the earlier stuff, it's kind of like, oh, everything rhymes. But then over time, as it gets more complex, they're finding their own sets of conventions and stuff and complexities that can make the rhyming patterns and the sonic techniques create something that's its own. Yeah, that's related, but it's its own thing.
I am curious about what Jeremy had mentioned earlier around like, what is it listening to in the background? And I do think that there's something there around a kind of spatialization. I mean, certainly the video is capturing something in the background, presumably, but like, can it hear something larger than what is actually on screen, and sort of try to process some of that? I was relaying a story before the call about some power lines in Hawaii that were killing off these parrots. And this is kind of early-ish AI, but they use machine learning to triangulate sort of the spaces around the power lines to figure out like where there was the most bird kills, basically the sound of birds flying into wires. And then they were able to bury the power lines in those areas in order to reduce loss. So that sort of larger spatialization, based on audio seems maybe a little insidious. I don't know. Maybe it's all a little insidious. You combine that with like what your Roomba data is telling you, and like becomes pretty clear that privacy is a bit of a fallacy at that point, right? We've given it all away for convenience. So there is sort of something there that could be sort of, I don't want to say weaponized, but used in a way. Again, it also could just be like tremendous amounts of data sitting in storage somewhere, in duplicate in some data center. So for someone to find and figure out later.
Well, it reminds me of that bag of chips signal that I think Udit brought in so long ago, which was, how much data you can actually get from a really low resolution image and what you can derive from that, and how this could be used in a similar kind of way. Small sounds in the background that could then be interpreted, and how much data can you actually get out of that?
I know, it's interesting. I think for me, it's all of these do point to some really cool, I guess the analog would be just like photography, just the ways that we record, transmit, reproduce sensorial expressions, and how we'll do that artistically. But yeah, I think all of those would be interesting. Anyway, signal or noise, Jared, what do you think?
I mean, actually, the most interesting thing for me was what Mimi was saying about kind of like people messing with data sets. Like, I don't think that was the intention. I think they were just like, oh, what would this sound like if we put it on a fan? But I actually think that could be something that happens more and more as people, they recognize like how much power they're effectively giving to these large data sets, that they start to screw with it a little bit as a way to sort of be like, we don't necessarily want you listening in on every piece of data and collecting every piece of data. So I do think it could potentially signal a kind of anti-surveillance sort of angle.
A little bit the Bodie McBodie face too, right? And enough people do a stupid thing that it sort of has impact.
Mimi, what do you think? Signal or noise?
I'm going to say there's a certain amount of signal in there, maybe a little fuzzy, so to speak. But yeah, I'm getting some reads on it. Also that it's just so immediate, right? Like if it's already kind of being messed with on TikTok, it means that it's probably in application somewhere else already, that the technology is, been harvested. So in that sense, it's not a signal anymore. It may just be like now, like that we're already in it.
Well, I will trust Valdis's initial instinct and say that this is noise. I brought a signal in today since Rada couldn't make it. And I'm curious if anyone has heard of this. It's called the Benjamin Franklin Society Library. It's what I'm calling a wonderfully delusional project of citational grandeur. They've also been called a wet lab for noospheric emergence. So what is it? From what I can tell, an earnest effort to digitize and to scale tools for sense making, specifically helping people deliberate on different points of view. It's a nonprofit organization. Their stated mission is, quote, to archive humanity's ideas, ideologies, and worldviews for future generations to understand, scrutinize, and more willfully choose to adopt or adapt. Basically, what they're doing is building databases of arguments, claims, and evidence from various media sources and trying to kind of model societal scale dialectics for educational purposes is what they call it. So what happens is information is organized into claims, arguments, and the supporting evidence, and those go into nodes. You can read these different nodes at different reading levels, basically, from like fourth grade to like unintelligible expert jargon. You can see it as a video clip. So the nodes are like kind of media agnostic. They'll have podcast clips, they'll have video, they'll have various levels of writing. But the idea is that you'll be able to take in these claims in any sort of media. They're mapping a visual representation of what they're calling the deliberation, basically like of what any individual should be doing in order to form an opinion about something, about an issue. The idea is that by creating this structured knowledge graph, there'll be many flexible ways to represent this knowledge. So in the future, you can look at it and aesthetically tell where the knowledge gaps are. And that's part of a project to create new ways of inducing comprehension, basically getting people to comprehend the complexity and depth of an issue without having to do all of the wide-ranging research on a subject. So here's like an example of a paper that they created. It's a very elegant kind of UX innovation, the way that this paper shows up as these 9 main positions, but it compiles, you can kind of unfold all these different media sources, and it compiles all of these different points of view, apparently. Yeah, I'll pause there for a minute and we can take a look. So like for each issue, they will have a paper like this, as well as a visualized like knowledge graph that looks more like a mural page or something like that.
I like that by the end, they just get to the point where the position is, who knows? That's the last position on the paper.
The 9 positions. It may be
really impossible to tell. Yeah.
And then the different epistemic reasons.
Probably goes to every paper and like, and then it was a dream. We don't know. We never know. I mean, my first instinct is to look to see who's the team, that looking for like whose opinions are, filtering what data and research is being compiled. So that's kind of my knee-jerk reaction to seeing something like this. Mm-hmm. I also just can't help but think of something that like in the last couple of days has been going around is people asking AI to describe the conflict going on in Gaza versus Israel, and how, in that simple dialectic there, right? Simple in quotes, all of the biases basically spill out immediately there in the way that that's represented. So it feels like it's trying to cut through that, but perhaps also reproducing it simultaneously.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. So I heard about this on Michael Garfield's Future Fossils podcast, where he was interviewing the founder, someone named Jamie Joyce. And at one point they referenced like the Simpsons beer, the cause of and solution to all life's problems, which is sort of like applies to like information technology in this case, that like we need projects like this one because of projects like this one, essentially. And from listening to this podcast, and they're clearly thinking very hard about trying to eliminate bias down to what order we put should we put the pros first or the cons first? Like, how do you, things like that. And, whether that's possible, like is a question. I think, will they develop some cool things along the way? Probably. Like I said, I think that the paper that they put together is like a pretty elegant way of doing things. Do you need to have every single point of view in one place? There's another question. Like, I relate a little bit to the urge to want to create things like this, like this feeling of like, if only we just had all of the information well organized for us instead of having to listen to talking heads arguing constantly. And if only someone was doing this work, and like, maybe that's okay. Like, maybe even if it's in the end impossible, actually just having multiple attempts at projects like these is good, and useful innovations, even at just like the feature level, will pop up.
It stretches my capacity to be whatever that foresight hat of like, oh, I don't know what it could mean or whatever. I tend to have a gut reaction to stuff like this. Just like when I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh man, this is like a trust fund debate kid who has deep like links to the NGO industrial complex, who's kind of, working on something for their, the future of their career. That's like the very cynical take on it. Cause like, even on the first page, I'm just like, man, I would never use this. Like, this is so hard to parse, and I also I think debate is a very bad model for how dialogue in society should be constructed. And I it shouldn't be about defending positions and destroying other positions and seeing all the other sides. That's me putting out like a very normative claim around like what I don't necessarily think political culture should look like. As to like, does it enable us to do different epistemological things? Like, maybe. I mean, that's what their tagline is, the epistemological revolution.
Yes, they're very humble in their claims then.
I mean, it's funny because like epistemological humility is one of the core beliefs, I guess, in doing this kind of work coming from that founder, which I mean is something that in some way share in the sense of like, yeah, how long can you resist having an opinion while learning about something? Like I was kind of thinking about this as like, would my answer to this just be like, why don't we just have the Society for Suspending Judgment about something, which like to actually like go through the process of creating a document like this with like, here are the 9 different perspectives we've synthesized about whether like what to do with this nuclear power plant. You need to have that before jumping into debate. I also wonder though, do you just end up losing a lot by trying to have everything on an equal footing? Like it's a noble attempt, but does it just dilute the arguments themselves when you try to sort of remove any emotional energy and rhetorical energy that they might have? I wonder about that too, whether it's good or bad.
This idea of debate not being the most useful tool anymore, also like the privileging of debate as a tool really kind of, I think, comes from that Enlightenment, sort of model of like, this is how we reasonably, sort of come to a conclusion on something, right? That it's drawing, really from quite a privileged sort of arc to get there. And, do we want to reinforce that? And not only do I think that like debate requires a civic sphere, and I think we are very quickly, or not even quickly, like we are like 6-8 years, I think 2015 to now, like deeply into a period of time where that civic sphere is so contested that debate doesn't operate in it. Like we cannot share enough space to create that debate. It becomes so polarized that it sort of is reinforcing a series of ways of operating that we may not be able to kind of hold on to anymore. So again, it might be a library or an archive in the sense that it houses the idea of debate at a moment where debate and argumentation is basically like falling away. It's like it's a little bit Alexandria library to me.
Yeah, I was going to reference like Encyclopedia Britannica. It kind of reminds me of, it gives me sort of like CD-ROM vibes a little bit, like
aesthetically. I mean, there's a lot that I think is really humorous about the way that they frame things. And I mean, even just, the Benjamin Franklin choice is like definitely has those kind of old school history CD-ROM vibes or whatever. That's interesting.
Did he have a method or something?
The Benjamin Franklin connection is that it's inspired by something called a junto, which I think is Spanish for togetherness, which essentially Benjamin Franklin would curate 12 intellectual acquaintances and they would all write essays on some particular issue and then come together and kind of synthesize it and, I don't know, get together and drink and talk it out, something like that. But it was kind of it was Benjamin Franklin's debate club, and
12 white guys who own land in the early United States.
Yeah, pretty much. What I did learn about that was where the concept of an American lending library came from. So that's an institution that I can get behind. So, yeah.
I mean, their stated values, and so they seem like noble, but I tend to agree with Mimi that like I've never cared for debate. When I used to debate, I used to find sort of like some of the methods of shutting down your opponent kind of like illogical in a way, like it didn't. And I also don't know that something like this necessarily changes opinion. You're still coming from a particular perspective, even though you're trying to sort of provide all perspectives. It's interesting to sort of provoke, like, does this change minds? Does it provide like sentiment, or does it remove sentiment? And what's lost in that process? Sort of what you were saying before, Rob, like, does it, you come to the table with seemingly all the information and all the perspectives. And if everyone's at the table with the same set of information, does that really help in the same way? I don't know.
Yeah. But I don't think it's trying to amplify that vibe of debate that we're talking about. Like, it's actually the opposite. It's, I think, trying to just like synthesize, remove all of that and lay everything out on equal terms so that you can, without, pushing you one way or another. So it's like, it's almost like the polar opposite of what you would get from, any 24-hour news channel, I think is much more where they're trying to go with that. And I think that's more the vibe where it's coming from. So yeah, I feel like maybe we were going on the wrong track with comparing it to debate. I think they mean that just simply in like situations where a choice needs to be made and where it's just unrealistic for people to have an informed decision based on how much information is out there and how it's presented.
Like, I'm for, sort of making an idea more complex, right? In the sense that, like, if you do a body of research, you are sort of taking away a polar position and adding kind of nuance and context. I think that actually in my criticism, that's what I'm always trying to do, right? Maybe controversially, I don't like to be like, I hate this building, or I like this building, or I hate this idea and I like this idea. But really, it's like this idea tells us something about, where we are in culture at this time. And I was speaking with David Hart, who's an artist and works sort of across photography, media, and increasingly throughout his practice, research comes, into it. And he says he's doing like that in order to expand, right, the context in which this work exists in, right, to bring in more ideas. And I wonder, like, do we need an archive of material that is synthesizing debate topics for us, or do we need more art that does that, right?
I love that point, and I think art and just that. I think, as Valdez was also suggesting before, that this is just not the way these things play out are in the world. And yes, it plays out in bars and podcasts and town halls and wherever, ideally. But then I think like there is this frustration. I have the same one about just every subject gets reduced to these two poles all the time. And we seem to really lose sight. And I think because it's just difficult for our brains, but we really seem to lose sight of the gradient between these two poles, or even the weirder combinations of different points of the gradient between these two poles. And so here you get presented with like these 9 points of view on it. And I wonder, I do think that that's probably better overall, or if I'm tasked to vote on this issue, I like the idea of being able to look at these 9 points of view. Does it then maybe also just do the same thing as the seeing two poles and sort of limit my brain to thinking, these are the 9, I must pick one? And does it in some way maybe hurt my creative ability to generate some unique solution, or to complicate it through art, or speculate in some other way that you just don't get as much by just having, here are the facts, I don't know.
I mean, it's intriguing to think about the rise of identification around non-binary. I say that because as we were talking about the scale, I was thinking like, is there a Kinsey, scale for politics, right? Not just for sexuality. It made me think like, at a moment in history where really there's an embrace amongst a kind of a generation to sort of bring up visibility around non-trans and non-binary, right? Where that classic binary has been so beautifully sort of integrated into like many choices of gendering and sexualities, that our sort of politics are hardening. So they're the kind of the self-identity versus the kind of civic representation of how we kind of deal with each other is are, sort of at odds. Does that make sense? I think maybe it's not even telling us anything new, but it's like, in one sense, debate has hardened, and there have been numerous articles about like how no one's changing their minds anymore. Like there's like the 4 independents, and otherwise people have really kind of held on to their ideological beliefs pretty consistently, whereas we're embracing from identity sort of a real kind of range of self-expression.
Yeah, there's so much in that. But what's also interesting about that range of self-expression is that there is this sense of the desire for a fixedness in how one identifies, even if that is to be, I identify as fluid, I identify as non-binary. There's this like sense of one needs a label, one needs a thing. And it's, to me, maybe that just points to like, this is just a thing. It's the only way our brains know how to make sense of the world is to kind of have have thoughts and labels and names and so on. And maybe why we need art more so than a layout of the 9 possible perspectives on a topic in order to understand it fully. But that is another thing that they're trying to do here, is this idea of using these knowledge graphs as inputs to various visual techniques for inducing comprehension, which is hard and can be exciting. And I wonder if that can be done in a sort of automated way or not at all. But that gets closer to something like generative art.
Generative politics.
Yeah. Generative politics. Well, they have another project that I haven't looked into called AI Politician, which I won't try and speak to, but I think it is kind of like that they're trying to use this politician to formulate some kind of solutions based on what the full debate that they're compiling. I think it's pretty experimental from what I could tell, but there's some interesting ideas coming out of this that they're trying. I started thinking about like the like laundry list of things that have attempted to do this, and even lending libraries in the first place as being part of this kind of a project, the kind of countless AI projects that have these kinds of vibes, whether that's like a Palantir type of thing, citation apps like Rap Genius or something like that, and the many that have come since. Just even like the idea of Google being to organize the world's information. And I kind of started thinking about like the aesthetics of and the feelings that we have about Wikipedia versus TED, where, you know, all of these things are imperfect in the end. They all fall into the problems of censorship, of biases, of political bents rather. And though they're imperfect, it's like something like Wikipedia doesn't leave a bad taste in your mouth, while something like TED maybe does. And so what is it that makes those things successful? And is it about like them knowing who they are and how they're governed? I don't know if everyone even agrees with me about this, like Wikipedia versus TED. Maybe it's that TED has this judgment about spreading good ideas, whereas Wikipedia is just like, we're getting the facts. But I'm consistently in awe that Wikipedia exists as it does and continues to.
Are you talking about like a semiotic, like look at like the signs of the, like what this is connoting, or something else?
No, I mean like the gist of the entirety, the vibe, the many connotations that we have around these things. Yeah.
The civics class vibe I'm getting from it, right? It's projecting a kind of smart neutrality, perhaps, like it's a container that we project into, or, you know, draw from. On the Wikipedia v. TED debate, I think it's about collective versus individual, right? That TED is about putting individuals out there to speak on expertise, whereas, you know, Wikipedia is collective knowledge. And it's fallible too. Like it's not always correct, and that it's up to this group effort to make it more correct in that regard. So it's sort of mutable and is changing across time. You know, it's live. And maybe that's what I worry about. Something like the Society Library, like these opinions. You know, how fixed are they? Like, are they scraping all the time in order to see how opinions are changing and how certain ideas are kind of crossing ideological sort of sectors?
I mean, I think it's project by project. I get the sense that it's pretty early on for them, for this project. Yeah.
Except for the funding. This is a deep prep school blue going on. This is a real aristocrat kind of vibe with that Roman logo or whatever as well. A real kind of center of the imperium.
I wonder whether that's strategic or what, because, and I mean, maybe it is, and maybe this is all consistent, but I found my way to the founder's CV, and which I didn't even catch if there was any sort of educational institutions on there. What there was were several Burning Man grants. So that's kind of where it's coming from.
So random.
And then it's like, so are these aesthetic choices just kind of, something that are like
prep school LARPing?
Yeah, prep school LARPing or a bit of a trick. Yeah.
They're based out of Florida. Did you catch that? Which is interesting. I mean, like interesting in many ways, like interesting in like to foster multiple opinions in a state like Florida, like seems like a positive thing. And then they're also from Florida, which makes me immediately like a bit suspect of like what, well, wait, you're trying to look like you're from like the mid-Atlantic with all of this like blue and logos and sort of, that civics vibe. And yet you're, based somewhere else. So
Interesting.
This conversation to me almost is like the perfect reason why it's fallible, because despite the fact that they've given us all like so much information, not only about themselves, the way that they're doing it, we're still like, they're from Florida. Like, I'm out. Like, forget it. But I just mean, it's like, it takes one piece of information and some background,
right,
or like a sentiment for somebody to go, well, now that perspective, I don't trust it so much anymore, or something. It's just an interesting sort of look at like human behavior and the thought process behind like how one arrives at a perspective.
Yeah, I get you. Like the idea that there's just no way to actually present yourself as like, here, we're the ones who are showing everything fair and square.
Because everybody's doing that from their perspective.
Yeah.
They're giving you the most researched perspective that they have, right? So
right.
Yeah, I just don't know if more information is the answer.
Yeah.
Notably, like we only read one paper, right? And that's as far as into the context we got.
True.
Yeah.
You can make judgments.
Judge a book by its cover.
Oh, the first sentence too. Just it says a lot. I also just want to like loop back to maybe adding a voice to defend a certain idea of like Enlightenment reason, which is not or was never actually of like instrumental rationality. It was always a form of thinking with intuition, judgment, emotion, moral elements. It's only in the last like century that the idea that reason should just be somehow relegated to a very reduced form of algorithmic rationality took hold, but it wasn't an Enlightenment idea. And so I want to bring that up because I think there's like a way that we could talk about collective reason that this site doesn't necessarily imply, at least in the way I read it. There is a real kind of condescending. I mean, even some of the t-shirts, like, let's be logical about this. It's like, no, let's hear people's like emotions. Let's hear people's situated perspectives. Let's not just read a bunch of abstract 9 positions that don't tell me whose interests are at stake in any of them, right? Who's going to be harmed and who's terrified. Like, it doesn't tell me anything that matters in a way. It's sort of strangely uninformative. Like if the goal is to get me, we were looking at one around like the nuclear plant, then that thing's been around or a center of controversy for so long. I don't know, from a quick scan, I did not get a better sense of what was going on. Also, there was no history in it, which is crazy, Yeah. Just this idea that you can logically take 9 positions and each is somehow has its pros and cons. Like, I do not think that's how anyone makes decisions. Like,
so is that a noise for you, Valdez?
Well, yeah, I would say noise for a certain reason. I think it's interesting. It's fun to talk about, but I would say it's a relic to me of that era, which is still sort of going on when all these like liberals are obsessed with disinformation and fake news and things like that I feel like just fundamentally misread what the problem was that was going on. And the idea that the solution to these things is just like an ostensibly more logical, debate-oriented culture, it just seems like wrong at so many levels, including at the level of reason itself.
Mimi, what do you think? Signal or noise? I'm
going to do noise, but as we've been talking, I'm thinking about like more towards the collective ways, like that. I'm gonna say signal to collective ways of processing opinion and thinking of through ideas of like storytelling or the griot or the drum circle or like, any time that we sort of move away from sort of the traditional reasonable models, right? So, is there a surrealist, sort of version of this, right? Where, we get into the kind of the mashup. I think that's why it's different perhaps than the Rap Genius there. But yeah, like I think that one actually is closer to a kind of collective form of knowledge because it produces art at the end, right? It doesn't just produce a position, it produces something that is interpretive. And then we kind of go back and read it and kind of do the interpretation, right? Like almost like midrash, and thinking about, okay, well, let's turn on these words and where it is coming from. So it's part of a larger collective.
Yeah, hearing that, and it just makes me think like, oh, maybe just like copy pasta memes or iterative memes are just a better way of doing this kind of collective sense making. Jared, what do you think? Signal or noise?
Oh man, I thought you had everybody on noise. I was like you were going to win the game show for sure. This is the first time everyone was going to say noise. I will say noise as well. I think it's like data noise. I thought the last signal was going to be the literal noise signal, but I'm going to go noise on this one as well.
Yeah. For me, the signal is like, information changes, media changes, and so there will be new collective sense-making tools. And, the ones like Wikipedia that have persisted, there will be another. Whether it's this, maybe not, but they will come up. And so maybe it's like one of the small UX innovations or something like that ends up sticking. But I think the fact that people are working on this is a signal. Mimi, what's your weakest signal?
So I'm bringing to the table this concept of planetary menopause, which is when we think about Earth not as like an Earth mother or Gaia, but Earth as like an auntie with hot flashes. And this is coming from an essay that was in Harper's Bazaar by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. She's the author of a book called Undrowned Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Animals. So there's a lot to unpack there. Her argument is that, like, extreme heat is creating the change in the same way that, like, women go through a menopausal change, and that these rising temperatures, are now globally correlated to thinking about the Earth as a body, and that we can sort of make collective and individual experiences of aging, this end of being able to reproduce, the metaphor but not metaphor. In fact, the essay is titled, This is Not a Metaphor. Heat is not a metaphor. And I'm interested in this for a few reasons. This isn't just like a new way to like talk about climate crisis, but that Alexis begins her essay writing about the 100 longfin pilot whales that beached themselves in Australia. And I was really moved by that. And it happened back in the summer. And the group was matriarchal. They rose from the deep and they followed the elder grandmother whale in beaching themselves, right? And it basically, was looking at a climate tragedy, right? Like the news reports were all like, oh my God, these whales beached themselves. But I think it also speaks to ways that things line up and how we listen to them. I think maybe listening is like a theme that's coming out of like our discussions today. And like these whales are like basically like screaming, right? But we hear it as a kind of like, this is tragedy, but what about like also the orcas that are knocking boats over and the otters that are grabbing surfboards, right? There is something that humans are like kind of refusing to listen to. We'd rather read it as individual events of one species doing something strange, right? But like if we start to see patterns in it, it's a lot of mammals basically going like, something's fucked, if I can say that on your podcast. But yeah, something's up, and like we are screaming that something is wrong and that humans have sort of overreached, have too far colonized our spaces. And in a way, it reminds me of classic Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and the dolphins are the first to take off, right? So long and thanks for all the fish, right? So it's about listening. It's about this corollary between planetary health and women's reproductive health, especially at a moment where women's reproductive health is so terribly understudied, but also at the same time so regulated. So I think these are kind of 2 points of contention that are sort of finding themselves in conversation here to sort of think about like, well, what is a menopausal system, right? Not just a fully mothering system, but like kind of a system at the end of one cycle and sort of changing into another. Yeah, I'll sort of leave it at that for now.
Yeah, it's like patterns of protest in nature. I really like the way you articulated it.
Yeah, as soon as you said it, I was like, oh, that's an interesting term. And I Googled it. And did you know it's like a kind of men's manosphere joke?
No.
Like, what is it? It's not climate warming, or it's not climate change. It's planetary menopause. And it's on t-shirts. It's like sold on like men's t-shirt websites and stuff like that.
God.
You know, like that kind of alt-righty thing, which is like interesting because like, I don't know, maybe I thought maybe she referenced it, but scanning through it doesn't look like she's doing that. You know how some people reclaim, things that are used against them.
I think like the series of events coupled with the terminology is interesting, given that you sort of say, like I've heard a lot about perimenopause lately and how it's something that's so, menopause in general is just well studied, and perimenopause is not even something that's discussed in many cases. And women are going to doctors and they're like, it's what they have this kind of shrugging it off, or like, no, don't worry about it. It is interesting that they kind of line up in the sense that there's a misunderstanding at play there. There's a sort of like not fully comprehending the system in a sense, and thinking that like we are somehow separate from these animals, that they wouldn't have the capacity to say like protest by throwing themselves on a beach, to say like, is this like, what else do we have to do? Do we have to beach our entire pod? Okay, we'll do that then. And still nothing. Okay, well, we'll get the otters involved. We're going to sink some yachts. So we'll talk to our orca friends. They'll sink some yachts, and maybe then you'll get it. But that there seems to be a strong disconnect in just the sense of like not understanding planetary systems, not even understanding our own bodies. And so that one sort of speaks to the other, that like whether the term is being used in the spirit that Valdis is, saying, or it's being like reclaimed, there's clearly like not a full understanding of like what's at play here, even though we all kind of recognize like what it means. I think, that it means the loss of so many species. It means like the loss of our own way of life. It's just funny that it's not funny, but it's funny that it would take something like that event to kind of give someone pause to consider how climate change is affecting the world.
Yeah, I think to me, it also is like a group of the population, like aging women, are rendered so invisible that in a way, like, all the aunties could scream as well. And it would also sort of take a lot to hear them. So it sort of, there's some nice parallels there. I also went to the theater recently. It wasn't a theater. It was actually the Wilson Observatory hosted a space opera by the Industry, which is a opera group, experimental opera group here in Los Angeles. And I saw an opera called Star Choir, and it was a space opera about the colonization of a planet because humans had completely destroyed their own planet. And when they land, the colonizers are infected by the lichen that are already living there, but they don't recognize that they're living there, that the lichen is sentient. But the lichen communicates with the humans by basically creating kind of a viral condition in their brain that creates hallucinations. And so like that is the lichen screaming, right? Like, get out of our space, like go. And then the moral of the opera is the humans that could adapt to this different way of communicating, they become empaths, basically. Those people survive, right? Those who can listen and interpret, and those who can't basically kill each other off because they go a bit crazy. The metaphor is kind of like beating you over the head with a stick. But I liked the idea of the lichen being the messenger, right? That they have adapted to like figure out a way to tell us something's up.
Well, they're also the prototypical symbiogenesis example, right? Because it's a algae and a fungi. living together effectively. In lichen, do they reproduce separately, those two elements, or no? Or do they do it together? It doesn't really matter for this instance, but I figured that was like another layer to the story, because there's a politics of like fusing with like other animal elements of ourselves that I guess has been quite popular since like the 80s and stuff like that, or the 90s. And that is quite interesting in the context of climate change. I don't know if you ever read like Lynn Margulis, a scientist who ended up popularizing the idea of symbiogenesis and coming up with like particular theories of how it happened and whatnot. And she also wrote like fantasy and sci-fi, and her stuff is like very weird. It's like worlds where like there's nothing like judgmental about humans. That's where I'm a little bit hesitant in some of the stuff where you say, where it's like, oh, we're like, it's almost like a Christian mesh. It's like we're the guilty of original sin, and our, touching of anything natural is immediately, brings it into the fallen world of like horrible humanity. And we're so awful and this and that. In Margulis, it's entirely natural. And so there are these symbiotic geneses that occur, I think, with like in her fantasy work that occur with bacteria that can eat plastics, and humans and these bacteria that can eat plastics have like fused together in a new species in her story. And again, it's like the plastic thing isn't this like horrible original sin. It's something that like in this instance is eventually, I don't want to use words like adapt because it's just going to bring me into trouble. But yeah, I don't have a better word. Adapted to those things in the long run. That's not to say that like, oh, do nothing, everything's fine. I don't mean it in that way. I just mean like, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder like the politics of making us feel like horribly guilty at mourning the death of all of this life. What does it do in terms of like moving us forward? It's an open question. It's not a judgment on it, but maybe a bit of skepticism or something around what that does.
I would say there's definitely a morality, I think, to the space opera. To even to the point that at the end of the space opera, when there is kind of the fusion of these species, the observatory doors open and light comes flooding in, right? So there is actually a kind of an ecclesiastic moment at the end, sort of within that opera. I would say within like this menopausal idea, I think it's less about moralizing like our own behaviors on Earth and more about reframing like who is seen, what do we listen to, if we are better at recognizing these signals, right? How do we open up those kind of conversations, or how do we sort of modify behavior, both personally and collectively? And yeah, no, it's not going to be like recycling is going to change the world of climate change. But, I also think about like, the deep sea server farms, right, that are sort of invading sort of territories that are not human territories, right? And so they create certain causal warming from the servers, which sort of changes the environment of marine life. So like maybe the morality is like, do that? Like, do we have to do that? Like,
yeah,
just saying.
That's where I find it's hard to say that much. I like it after when you first presented this. It's like, I don't know. We're in this time where, on the one hand, there are obviously these massive encroachments of humans and human technology into other species habitats, and then strangely, there's many small, very niche type of signals of activity in the arts and elsewhere, of people wanting to do more interspecies interfacing and like psychedelic movements and different ways of like, how can we better interface with, communicate with, understand the natural world. And then when we see these patterns of protest, as how I'm kind of thinking about it, it's like, yeah, like you say, we don't listen to the whales like we wouldn't listen to the aunties, and then where do you go from there? It's like, well, yeah, maybe we just do less.
I mean, there is a little callback, right? Like we could go back to the TikTok audio sampler, right? Like, where are we applying those technologies? Like, not that we need a technology to interpret the messages of this pod, but it does make me think about that interspecies communication a little bit, right? Like if, my pod of whales may speak to me in the sound of Tom Cruise's voice, but will I be able to listen to what it and actually hear what they're trying to tell us?
Yeah. Oh, there's something just really interesting to me about what you see on TikTok of just all these people engaged in these like intimate acts of transliteration of like moss and mycelium and stuff like that. Of how can I amplify these sounds of these things, or somehow interpret the signals coming from my plant neighbors.
And I fully also agree that like aesthetic responses to the ongoing crisis are like incredibly important. And I was actually surprised that, but it might be because it's like the classic dead white guy from the 19th century, but like Herman Melville's Moby Dick wasn't raised, because when you said screaming whales, that's like the first thing I thought of. And because we didn't grow up in that context, we don't remember that, like, where is it, Maine, that it takes place? It's like the heart of like one of the biggest industries of that time, right? It's like the get rich quick scheme. And it involves like massacring the entire like Atlantic Ocean population of whales and stuff like that. And so it too is built on ecological devastation. And like that story is one that, yeah, involves all of this stuff in the background around industrialization that we just like did not, I think you don't really realize, having grown up in the 20th century, when like oils are all like synthetic and stuff like that. Whereas back then it was like whale blubber, used to grease the industrial machinery and light things and all that stuff. There's been a lot of like artistic work on the ocean as well, and like hybrid collaborations between like artists and scientists and anthropologists on the ocean. I feel like it's been a real a trend is to light a word or whatever, but a kind of energy in that space, which is interesting because I think part of it is that like, and I don't think these are exclusive positions, but sometimes they get exclusivized. There's like some people who look up at space and they're like, oh, this is the next frontier. And then others are like, wait a minute, like we literally know less about the bottom of the ocean than we do about like the surface of Mars and stuff like that. And we just have less information. We've never been down there. It's very hard to get there. There's so much that goes on. It's such an important heat sink. It's important for the gas cycles, the long-term carbon cycles, things like that. Yeah, it's the opposite of just like a bacteria that's inside of us. It's like the thing that's like so giant all around us on the big blue planet, and we don't even really know that much about it.
Yeah, and it's just like, it's where everything ends up in a way, like in our imaginary. If you want it to go away, you sink it, right? Like the space junk comes back and like falls into this like one area of the ocean and sinks, and that becomes its own sort of reef of stuff, right? But it also just disappears, right? Like, or you flush it and it all sort of heads back out to sea.
And we are literally it too. Like we are like all animals are just like sacks of moisture, right? That have been like a water bottle, to bring it onto land. That's what we are effectively. We internalize the water that used to be around us and we keep it inside. But all of that comes from like the oceans and stuff like that, and using plants to pump it over the continent. But yeah, we're just like mobile pieces of ocean moving on granite or whatever.
And maybe that's sort of why the relationship to sort of mammals feels so profound, right? Like that we're not talking about fish exactly because we are so much closer to these mammals. That I think one of the things that was written about the whales that beach themselves was that the weight of their own bodies crush once they're on land because they're not buoyed by water. And so there is those sort of physiological differences is sort of what separates us, but in many other ways, like, we both breathe air and, sort of reproduce similarly. And so I don't know, there's something, I don't have a full point on that one, but I think there's something interesting in where empathy goes, right? Like how we find those points of connection.
Yeah. I mean, if they share the same body plans as us, which is like, and the same reproductive cycles, but right, they're mammals, so they have live births and stuff like that, which is they went back into the ocean, right? They were like all mammals are descended from basically like a shrew on the land, and some of them like whales and dolphins went back into the ocean, which is very weird to think about it in that sense.
Asta. We're heading over here.
Yeah, we still have hope.
About this signal, noise.
Man, I don't know. I think there's something in like how people are reconceiving relationships between cycles of reproduction at like individual and planetary scales, I guess. And I mean, I don't know how much it was raised in the conversation, but the idea of planetary menopause also, it's like that term late capitalism. It's like people have always been using it, which is kind of like, how do you know, or whatever. But like the idea that we're on a late planet also like resonates with like some things that other people have spoken about in very different communities who are kind of like, you know, the chance of so-called intelligent life reemerging if we lose it this time is very little. And so there's like that crowd of people who are really concerned for different reasons about the possible extinction of humans and other life forms. So in that entangled mesh of concepts, I think there's like something going on in how people are trying to reconceive at both aesthetic and scientific levels of what these changes that we're inducing will do in the future.
Jared, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it maybe falls within a constellation of signals that relate to the more than human conversation. I mean, I do think that there's merit in trying to like bring the climate conversation sort of closer to home in the sense of marrying it to a very human type of system, despite the fact that we don't seem to know very much about that system. And I think there's maybe an irony or something there, but like it does seem to signal a sort of yearning for a broader understanding of how these systems interrelate. And maybe that's what the author is trying to do is, again, like Mimi, you were saying, try to encourage a sort of active listening of a different sort.
Yeah, I feel like it's just a really appropriate and useful and generative phrase.
We reclaim it from the men's groups now.
I was going to say, you're going to get the t-shirt, Rob, or Mimi, you too.
I think I could use a t-shirt.
Broadcast from later. Thank you, Mimi.
And thank you for having me. Like, this is really just what a pleasure to be able to like spin this out for a couple hours on a Tuesday morning.